I knew the air had shifted when Jace dumped an entire compliance binder into a trash bin and said, "This company isn't about checklists anymore, it's about courage." I was standing 15 feet away, mid-conversation with an emissions contractor, and I watched the corner of the Title V permit summary curl up in the heat of a nearby exhaust vent. That document had taken me 3 weeks of cross-referenced data entry, and he treated it like a pizza coupon. That's when I knew we weren't just updating workflows. We were inviting disaster with a smile and a buzzword. For 7 years, I was the quiet spine of Halvik's Chemicals. I didn't talk much in meetings. I didn't argue in memos. I signed what needed signing, archived what needed archiving, and ensured every ounce of nitrogen dioxide was accounted for on schedule. You know, that kind of silence that keeps a company breathing? That was me. But Jace? He didn't hear silence. He only heard absence, and he filled it with noise. Before I go on, if you're listening and you haven't already subscribed or liked the video, it really helps the team behind these stories. About 97% of people never subscribe, but it keeps us going. So, if you're still here, hit that button. We've got more real stories coming your way. Jace came in swinging like every inherited suit parasite I've ever met. He walked through the plant like he'd just invented stainless steel. Told the safety officer her emergency signage was clutter. Rolled his eyes when I mentioned quarterly self-inspections. At one point, I caught him pitching AI-based environmental ops to the board, and I swear to God he couldn't define PM 2.5 if you stapled the answer to his forehead. Still, I kept my tone even. People like Jace don't last. They flash, burn, and leave just enough ash for the next one to step around. I didn't make waves. I just kept the ship from sinking, and truthfully, I liked it that way. My office was a windowless supply closet in the admin wing, but it had a locked cabinet, 3 encrypted drives, and a backup fan with a personality. My name was on every federal report that mattered. My login was the gatekeeper for 5 terabytes of emissions data going back to 2013. I wasn't important. I was foundational. So when Jace strolled by my desk one morning, paused just long enough to scan my screens, and said, "Honestly, this all feels like a librarian's wet dream," I didn't flinch. I just minimized the active EPA submission I was working on and looked him straight in the eyes. "That librarian," I said calmly, "is the only reason your father's company still has a functioning air permit." He laughed, that smug tech bro chuckle like I'd just suggested faxing a selfie. "Yeah, okay, let's talk soon about simplifying this whole record-keeping thing." He didn't talk to me again for 6 days, but when he did, it was with a letter, and a grin, and a trash can next to his desk. It was a Tuesday, the kind of day you can feel the storm before you see it. The smell of fresh paint in the admin wing was Jace's latest contribution to culture. Same cheap gray they use in startups to fake innovation. I already knew something was coming. He'd canceled my weekly compliance sync with legal and rescheduled it as a strategic ops review with HR. You don't need to be a psychic to read the writing when it's printed on meeting invites. Jace didn't sit behind his desk when I walked in. He leaned against it like some startup TED talker, arms crossed, grinning like he'd just solved middle management. The letter was already out, placed perfectly on the desk like a souvenir from his ego trip. 1 page, crisp header, full of empty words. Restructure, automation, new direction. I didn't need to read it. I'd written cleaner terminations myself for interns who stole coffee pods. He started in with that smug, almost rehearsed tone. "Look, you've done good work, no doubt, but we're pivoting toward lean operations, agile workflows, less dependency on manual logs." "You mean compliance?" I said. He didn't miss a beat. "We've got software now, tools that don't need babysitting. Honestly, we need leaders, not paper pushers." Then he laughed, like the idea of compliance was a joke, like I was the punchline. I nodded, didn't blink. "So who's the new responsible official on our title feed?" He raised an eyebrow. "Title what?" I didn't answer. I just let the silence stretch. Watching him flounder for half a second was the most satisfying thing I'd experienced since he arrived. "Right. Don't worry. I'll sign whatever needs signing," he said, waving a hand like the EPA was a Netflix subscription. I asked for the termination in writing. He handed me the letter, half proud, half distracted, like he'd expected me to cry or beg or collapse into some HR therapy spiral. Instead, I tucked the letter into my bag and pulled a second item from my own folder, a printed index of the compliance archive system I'd personally maintained since 2013. His eyes glanced over the codes, file names, retention schedules. I could almost hear his brain buffering. "You'll need this," I said simply, "unless you're planning to reinvent 10 years of documentation by Thursday." He scoffed. "It's all backed up somewhere, right?" I just smiled. "You'd be amazed how much of it is still tied to user credentials, mine specifically." He shrugged, clearly not understanding the depth of what he'd just undone, and I didn't offer to explain it. Explaining would have meant staying, and I was done gifting free lessons to men who thought they were teaching me something. By the time I walked out, the air felt lighter, not freer, just still, like the moment before a match hits gasoline. I packed up my office with surgical precision, my plant badge, my hard copy of the annual toxic release inventory, my backup USB drives from the last 3 quarterly audits, nothing that belonged to them. Everything that belonged to the job. By 5 p.m., I was officially locked out. Logins dead, VPN revoked, one-click oblivion. But that's the thing with compliance. It doesn't live on their server. It lives in process, in retention, in knowledge, and they'd just thrown all 3 out with the person who built them. The first text came on a Friday evening, just as I was pouring a glass of wine. "Hey, quick question. Do you know where the Q1 2020 emissions data went?" I stared at the screen for a moment. Not because I didn't know, but because I did. It was sitting on a secure backup drive in a weatherproof box inside my storage unit, tagged, indexed, hashed, and sealed, and completely inaccessible to anyone but me. The second message hit harder. Jace deleted the entire compliance drive, said it was taking up space on the server. That one made me pause mid-sip. Not because I was surprised, God no, but because it confirmed just how deep his ignorance went. That drive wasn't a collection of Word docs and spreadsheets. It was a living record, a legally bound digital chain of environmental accountability. And now, gone. Or so he thought. Then came the third. Legal just asked if we ever kept hard copies of emissions logs. I didn't know what to say. I didn't respond. I didn't need to, because buried in a locked cabinet 6 miles from the plant was every notarized quarterly report, every emissions variance explanation, every regulatory email I ever received. Time-stamped, authenticated, untouched. That night, I pulled the file box from under my bed and flipped open the folder labeled Post-Termination Protocol. Inside, I had a clean printout of the certificate of record retention I'd filed with legal 2 weeks before Jace even arrived. It detailed what I maintained, where it lived, and under what access conditions it could be retrieved. The key sentence? Digital access to all EPA-regulated emissions documentation is linked to the user credential, redacted, and subject to termination upon employee separation without authorized transitional custodianship. Translation. When they fired me without a replacement, they didn't just lose a person, they broke the chain of custody. I printed that page again, slipped it into a new manila folder, labeled it for reference. You'd think they'd have realized something was wrong when the emissions auto-reporting bot failed to send that Friday. But no, they probably blamed IT, or the cloud, or whatever buzzword Jace could say without blinking. They didn't know that bot ran off my credentials and used my encrypted templates. No handoff, no override, just silence. And in compliance, silence isn't golden, it's radioactive. Still, I didn't call, didn't write, didn't even gloat to the one colleague who had always respected what I did. Because this wasn't revenge. Not yet. This was the absence of sound, the part in the movie where everyone keeps talking until they realize the power's been cut. I just sat back, kept my wine glass full, and watched the edge of the storm build on the horizon. They had no idea what they'd thrown away, but the EPA would. Very, very soon. The storage unit still smelled faintly of cardboard and dust, like every forgotten place built to outlive memory. I hadn't stepped inside since my last audit cycle, but everything was exactly where I'd left it, right down to the temperature-controlled fireproof cabinet tucked in the back. Unit 2387, nestled between someone's broken treadmill and what I could only assume was a taxidermied elk in the unit next door. I flicked on the dim overhead light and unlocked the cabinet. There they were. My insurance policy in 3-ring binders, 6 of them, each one sealed in archival plastic, each with my signature and the date stamped across the spine, every page inside notarized, indexed by year, by permit class, by pollutant. Some of those emissions logs had been used in congressional reports. Halvix was no mom-and-pop dump site. We ran major ops, and the feds didn't just glance at us once a year. They tracked us quarterly, which meant the logs I held in my hands weren't just records. They were liabilities, or lifelines, depending on who had them. I pulled out the red-labeled binder from 2016, the year of the scrubber upgrade, and flipped to the log of deviation reports. Still crisp, still perfect. Every instance where we'd exceeded thresholds documented with corrective action. Every signature mine. Jace could delete what he wanted from the server, but he couldn't erase what lived in these pages. Or on the 4 USB drives lined neatly in the foam insert below them, each encrypted, each containing a hashed mirror of the cloud backups, plus compliance bot source code tied directly to my credentials. And then there was the book. The Access Logbook, handwritten monthly entries signed by both me and the plant manager for 7 years, showing chain of custody, access dates, cross-checks, untouchable, irrefutable. I sat down on the small metal stool and reviewed one entry after another. Permit renewals, internal audits, communications with the EPA, copies of every auto-generated submission, even the scripts that pulled PM10 values from our stack sensors every 4 hours. Jace had been so eager to torch it all that he never stopped to ask where the ashes would fall. Once I was satisfied, I opened my laptop, tethered to my phone, and drafted a single, simple email, addressed to my primary liaison at the EPA, Darla Fisher. She'd been through 2 administrations and more shutdown threats than I could count. Subject line, change in RO status, Halvix Chemicals, body. Dear Ms. Fisher, just a formal update. As of date, I am no longer employed by Halvix Chemicals and no longer serve as responsible official for compliance reporting. To my knowledge, no replacement has been named. I hit send. 5 minutes later, a reply landed. Thank you for the clarity. That was it. 5 words. But I knew what they meant. The EPA doesn't chase companies. They track people. And when the person listed on 10 years of documentation sends an exit memo with no successor, it doesn't go in a folder. It goes to enforcement. I closed my laptop, and for the first time in weeks, I smiled. Not because I wanted chaos, but because I knew exactly where the fault line was now, and who had just stepped directly on top of it. I was standing in the kitchen, half listening to my coffee machine sputter like it was exhaling its final breath, when my phone buzzed. I didn't recognize the number, but the area code was local. I picked up. She didn't say her name, just whispered, "You didn't hear this from me." It was Liz, from procurement. Voice low like she was calling from inside a confession booth. "The EPA's here, right now. Jace thought they were doing some networking thing, maybe even a grant pitch. He wore his new blazer. You know, the one with the dumb little pocket square?" I didn't respond. I just waited. They asked for the 10-year historical emissions record. Jace tried to pull up a dashboard that doesn't even exist. Then he told them, "Our guy left. We're digitizing now." There was silence on her end for a beat, like she was bracing for my reaction. I stayed quiet. She exhaled sharply. Then the lead inspector asked who the current compliance officer was. Another pause. And no one had an answer. HR hadn't filled the role. "Your name's still on every license, every file, every submission ID," she whispered. "They're not smiling anymore." I thanked her, told her to hang up and pretend she'd never called. Because if the EPA was on-site unannounced, asking questions about document continuity, it wasn't a check-in, it was a probe. I moved to my desk, heart steady, hands calm, opened my laptop. Nothing urgent in my inbox, no alerts, no new filings. But in the upper corner of the screen was that one blinking icon, voicemail. I hadn't checked it over the weekend. Figured it was a leftover robocall, or maybe my sister reminding me to RSVP for Thanksgiving. But when I pressed play, the voice that came through wasn't selling car insurance. This is Agent Moore from the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency Enforcement Division. We're conducting a records continuity review under Federal Compliance Standard 40 CFR Part 70. We understand you recently separated from Halvix Chemicals. We're reaching out to confirm the last authorized date of your compliance officer responsibilities. Please return this call before noon today. It is not a courtesy request. I listened twice. The phrase, "not a courtesy request," hit harder the second time. I knew what they were about to do. The EPA doesn't play games with emissions tracking. They don't do friendly chats in boardrooms with men in overpriced suits and no chain of custody plan. If your logs vanish, if your responsible official disappears, if your documentation trail breaks at any point, the assumption is not, oops, it's fraud. I took a long sip of cold coffee and stared out the window as a city truck rumbled past. Somewhere across town, Jace was probably still clicking through Google Drive folders, sweating through his blazer, hoping the inspectors would buy whatever half-scripted jargon he was feeding them. But they wouldn't, because the moment they asked who was responsible and got no answer, they weren't just collecting notes anymore. They were writing the opening paragraph of a closure report, and I hadn't even said a word. The call came at 2:47 p.m., exactly 5 minutes after I finished scanning the last of my handwritten access logs into a secure backup folder. I recognized the number. EPA Enforcement, DC Field Office, not the usual liaison who sent polite check-ins and form requests. This was from the side of the agency that didn't ask questions. They documented violations. I answered with the same tone I used in court-adjacent meetings. Neutral, factual, measured. Ms. Rayner, this is Agent Moore again. We're calling to notify you that under 40 CFR paragraph 70.7F, we are initiating a temporary suspension of Halvix Chemicals Title V air permit due to lack of active record custodianship and documentation continuity. He wasn't looking for my opinion. He wasn't checking in. He was checking a box. Then came the question. Are you available for third-party verification of the records last held in your custody? My eyes moved instinctively to the cabinet at the far end of the room. I can confirm, I said, that I maintained accurate and complete records through date, including emissions logs, deviation reports, and permit renewals. After that date, my access and authorization were fully revoked. I have had no direct involvement since. There was a pause. Not doubt, just protocol. Understood, Agent Moore said. We'll cite lack of continuity as grounds. And just like that, the sword dropped. A permit suspension under Section 113 wasn't a slap on the wrist. It wasn't a warning letter. It was the regulatory equivalent of cutting the oxygen to a facility. No air permit, no operations. Not unless and until the EPA approved a new compliance officer, reconstructed the document trail, and validated every missing month. In other words, good luck, gentlemen. I hung up. No shaking hands, no adrenaline, just that calm, quiet awareness that something irreversible had just begun and I hadn't had to push it. I just stopped holding it up. I walked over to my file cabinet. Top drawer, center folder. A printed copy of the employment termination letter I'd been given 2 weeks ago. Across the top, stamped in black, internal, final. I had annotated it with a sticky note that read, removed without transition. I took the letter, slid it into the back of a fireproof envelope labeled Halvix End Phase, and returned it to the drawer. Then, almost ceremonially, I printed a clean label. Archive, retired. That drawer hadn't been opened in years. Now it closed with a sound that felt more like punctuation than storage. Outside, the wind was picking up, just a little, enough to move the branches on the trees lining my street. And I thought of the Halvix plant, all its chimneys, its furnaces, its automation tools that never quite replaced people. I imagined Jace pacing the hallway, shirt untucked, yelling into a Bluetooth earpiece, trying to Google what Section 113 meant. He wouldn't find what he wanted. Because you can't digitize respect. You can't automate history. And you sure as hell can't fake continuity when the last person holding the keys just filed their copy of the exit papers under done. Halvix's front lobby was all glass and bravado. A brushed steel logo. A quote about innovation stenciled across the reception wall. Something Jace had picked out. Probably from a Pinterest board labeled Disruption Aesthetic. But at 9:01 a.m., sharp, That shine didn't matter because the two people who walked through those glass doors weren't investors or influencers or city council photo ops. They were federal, and they were there to turn the lights off. One wore a Navy EPA windbreaker and carried a clipboard so thick it could stop a bullet. The other had a manila envelope tucked under his arm, sealed with a red tag. Halvix's future folded between two layers of bureaucratic finality. They bypassed the receptionist entirely and headed straight to the operations wing. Someone tried to offer them coffee. They declined. Jace, ever the oblivious optimist, thought this was salvageable. I heard later he'd actually cracked a joke when they introduced themselves. "Hope you're not here for the snacks. We're out of donuts." He laughed alone, then waved them in like he was still in control. The clipboard inspector didn't flinch. "We're here for emissions records, 10 years worth. All permit documentation, deviation logs, RO sign-offs, quarterly certifications, and associated backup." Jace gestured toward the operations manager, who looked like he was already halfway to cardiac arrest. "Yeah, so we let the last guy go yesterday," Jace said, casual, smug. "We're modernizing, going paperless. All that stuff's in transition." The agent blinked once. "You fired your listed responsible officer yesterday?" "Correct. It's part of our strategic shift." "Strategic shift," the agent repeated, flipping to the current permit. My name still at the bottom. "And to confirm," he added, "no successor was filed? No change of RO form submitted?" "Not yet, but we're working on it," Jace replied. "We've got AI-based logging now, real-time analytics, very cutting edge." That's when they stopped writing. The second inspector, the one with the red-tagged envelope, pulled it out and laid it flat on the desk. "We're issuing a temporary cease operation order effective immediately," he said, his voice neutral but not cold. "Due to the absence of verified compliance documentation and responsible oversight, Halvix Chemicals' air permit is suspended pending full audit." Jace blinked. "Wait, what? Today? But we've got shipments going out." "No," the agent interrupted. "You don't." That's when the operations manager sat down, just dropped into a chair like the floor had given out. By 9:35 a.m., facility access cards were being disabled. Internal emails were bouncing. The plant's main floor, which had been humming like a beehive just minutes before, fell into a frozen kind of silence. Trucks were stopped mid-load. Contractors were escorted out. And the intercom announcements, which usually chirped about lunch specials or parking lot alerts, simply fell quiet. The inspectors didn't shout. They didn't need to. The law was louder than any of them. And Jace? He kept pacing, kept calling someone on speaker, maybe his stepfather, maybe a lawyer, maybe just someone willing to tell him this wasn't happening. But it was. Across town, I watched a quiet live stream feed from the Halvix website glitch and go dark. Then I opened my file and began drafting my third-party audit report, because someone was going to ask for a reconstruction. And I was already 15 steps ahead. They taped the front gates first. Bright orange, plastic barricades stamped with federal codes. Then came the perimeter tape across the loading bays, the side entrances, the staff parking lot. By noon, the entire Halvix plant looked less like a chemical manufacturer and more like a crime scene waiting for yellow jackets and news vans. Employees stood outside in their uniforms, clutching phones, confused and angry. No one had told them why their badges didn't work. No one knew who was in charge. The internal memo sent at 11:47 a.m. read like a wet Band-Aid. Due to temporary regulatory realignment, all plant operations are suspended until further notice. No mention of the EPA, no mention of a 10-year documentation void, just that slippery corporate language, misalignment, transition, strategy meant to distract from the smell of fire. Inside, Jace was unraveling. According to Liz, God bless her and her passive-aggressive texting skills, he'd locked himself in the executive conference room and was screaming into a speakerphone, alternating between "find the fikaking logs" and "call my stepdad right now." At one point, he even tried to reboot the old compliance server, only to realize it had been wiped clean the week prior, by him. And legal? Legal wasn't helping. They'd finally pulled the full contract set for the plant's operating license and started tracing through the EPA filings. Every signature? Mine. Every certification? Mine. Every point of contact for environmental audits, emissions violations, compliance reporting, renewal applications, one name, mine. No secondary, no successor. One junior counsel reportedly asked, "Did no one file a continuity declaration?" The silence in the room must have been deafening. Jace's stepfather did try to step in, flew back early from a philanthropy summit in Aspen, rolled into the office in a Navy windbreaker like he was about to save the day. But the EPA wasn't interested in family drama. They don't deal in feelings, they deal in gaps. And the gap between my termination and their unreported permit custodianship was big enough to bury the whole plant in. Meanwhile, I sat 2 miles away, sipping a lukewarm latte with oat milk at a coffee shop that smelled like burnt beans and college regret. My laptop screen showed 4 tabs. My inbox, the EPA's document request form, the draft of my third-party audit proposal, and a news site. I watched the ticker crawl across the bottom of the local feed. Halvik's environmental shutdown pending audit. No drama, no context, just those 5 words. Enough to set off shareholder panic and make every local competitor lick their lips. A young woman at the table next to me looked up from her tablet and said, "Oh wow, that's our plant, isn't it?" I nodded but said nothing, just stirred my coffee as if the whole thing had nothing to do with me. She sighed. "My uncle works there. Hope it's not serious." I offered a neutral smile. "I'm sure it'll sort itself out." Because here's the thing, it wouldn't. Not soon, not easily. Not unless they could rebuild a decade of documentation, pass a federal audit, and convince an entire agency that they suddenly cared about what they'd just torched. And I knew for a fact they couldn't. Because the only person who could even begin that process had just ordered another coffee and clicked send on a document titled Proposal, Temporary Compliance Officer Assignment, Halvik's Reconstruction. 2 weeks later, I walked back through the same glass doors that had once seen me off in silence. This time, I wasn't escorted out. I was welcomed in. The Halvik's logo was gone, peeled off like a bandage from a bad decision. In its place, a fresh name, Claremont Industrial Holdings. New branding, new investors, same pipes, same stacks, same skeleton of a company, but with one very important shift. Me. The buyout group had circled fast. Once the shutdown made the papers, Halvik's creditors lost their appetite. The EPA's report didn't mince words. Operational negligence, compliance breakdown, custodial void. Terms that translate directly into devaluation and opportunity. They called me directly. Not to negotiate, not to interview, just to ask one question. "Can you rebuild the chain?" I told them I never broke it. So they wrote my name into the deal. Clause 3.2.3, subpoint A. All environmental filings, certifications, audits, and submissions shall be signed, verified, and managed under the authority of Ms. Rachel Rayner, independent regulatory consultant. It wasn't a title. It was a keystone. I showed up the morning of the reopening in clean boots and a pressed jacket. The new compliance assistant, a sharp woman named Tara with a calm voice and 3 sharpened pencils already lined up on her desk, greeted me like a doctor arriving for triage. She didn't waste time. She handed me the first document. A revised emissions declaration for Q2. I signed it. The buyer's lead rep, a quiet woman in her 50s with the eyes of someone who'd read too many financial ruin stories, stopped me near the new break room. "You still keep those logs?" she asked, voice level. I pulled a small hard drive from my bag and handed it to her. Everything. Backed up. Chronological. Authenticated. Cross-verified. She smiled faintly. "Some of us don't throw things away." "No," I said. "Some of us build foundations no one notices until someone else knocks down the walls." Jace, of course, was nowhere to be found. Rumor said he fled to some tech startup in Arizona, probably pitching carbon-neutral NFTs or whatever new nonsense would let him feel important again. His stepfather's board seat had vanished with the last investor withdrawal. No plaque. No farewell. Just another shut door in a wing of shut doors. As I walked through the facility one last time that afternoon, I passed the executive hallway, once lined with framed buzzwords and stock photos of smiling workers. Now, empty. Lights off, the air thick with the kind of quiet that only follows hubris. I paused in front of what used to be Jace's office. The door was still closed, the blinds drawn, no nameplate, no noise. Then I turned, badge clipped to my blazer, and headed down the hall where actual work was being done. Tara was already sorting forms for next month's reporting cycle. A printer hummed. A compliance dashboard blinked quietly to life. And I thought to myself, not with pride, not with vengeance, just with clarity. Turns out, keeping paperwork kept the power.